Good morning, everyone. We are very excited to meet you, all of you. There's a lot of good stuff about UI5 today that we want to share with you. So my name is Ram, and I'm a developer, UI Flexibility Services. So you certainly heard about the term evolution, evolution in the keynote. So what is this evolution is all about? Evolution is UI5 Evolution is the innovation project for UI5 where we address current problems and we come up with the solutions. Not only this, but we also want to advance our framework, our controls, as well as the tools. So what is the main goals or motives behind this? The first one and foremost one is that we want to make your UI5 applications run fast. In order to do that, we want your code to be more modular, not only modular, but also to be clean as well as concise. So the next aspect of it is whenever you want to you are working with a code, you always wanted to work with a code which is future proof. What does this mean? Like embracing the new technologies and trends like AMD module loading that we have already included in UI5. So we are making our foundation future proof. So in order to uh, integrate your applications with emerging technologies as well as other open projects, we are becoming more open. In this way, we are not, it's a open, UI5 is again an open source project. So we are also giving back to the community and we are also contributing to other open projects as well as technologies too. The one major problem or the one major challenge that we always have is the compatibility. We want to make sure that your applications, whatever you're writing today, is compatible along with the future releases as well. So what does this yin and yang represents? So this signifies the whole goals of UI5 evolution, and it also signifies that we can only achieve it together. There are two parts to it. The first one is Think Evo, and the second one, on other hand, is Use Evo. So what is Think Evo? Think Evo is a right mindset. In the sense, we the mindset to become like more open and also to get yourself familiarized with newest trends and technologies. And use Evo is, I'm sorry, yeah. Use Evo in on other hand is that you're using right set of feature set for your development as well as you're using right development tools. The best thing about UI5 evolution is that you don't have to wait anymore. So the evolution is already there in today's UI5 code base and can be used for applications. So you can define your dependencies. You can use new asynchronous APIs. There are a lot of APIs that we have already come up with, and you can orchestrate your code execution. We are working really hard to make it happen, and it's mostly because of compatibility reasons. So to carefully split our code base in a compatible way and also to provide very good development as well as build toolings. So you can, the entire UI5 is layered as in the keynote Frederic mentioned, so we have now have layered architecture embedded in UI5. The main challenge that we have to in the beginning is that UI5 comes with a lot of feature set, right? So, but rather it is monolith. So, although it has been designed for modularization, so there is a tight coupling between and within the core with the other libraries. So, and the rendering and the controls, and of course the programming model. So the solution for this, again, is split the different parts of UI5 into distinct modular layers. The core, the rendering and the control, and the programming model, all these things are again supported with build and development tooling. Today, in this session, we'll be touching more upon modular core and some part of build and development tooling. Uh, so modular core, as you know, is a foundation for everything. Uh, so we want to establish a future-proof foundation for the code organization, dependency management, and enabling your application to run with as minimum dependencies as possible. So how we envision ourselves? We want to be like collection of bricks. If you just imagine Lego bricks, so they have their own value and they can exist independently. We had to really go through our core, and we had to restructure this core by splitting it into different modules and in a more granular way. And we have also included AMD like module syntax to enforce dependency management. We had to clear all these dependencies. So there is no some internal magic so that your application is somehow running. You have to include all these dependencies. And one major key takeaway here in this session is that yeah, you have to get rid of globals. If you are using any legacy global APIs in a global way, we ask you or we encourage you to use the async AMD like syntax and get rid of it. Oops, I'm sorry. Okay. The next thing is it only about splitting into modules? It is not, right? So it's also about where do we place these modules? Where does these modules belongs? In the morning in the keynote, if you have attended, you've already seen the new way of using the controls. That is using web component APIs. There it doesn't require jQuery or DOM manipulations. So so we have split the modules in such a way, the one which basically needs these dependencies and the one which is independent of DOM as well as jQuery. The lower layers, which is independent of DOM and jQuery dependencies, are in the base layer, and the upper layer with more feature set, those things are in UI layer. So you can now develop applications directly using this base layer in Node.js environment as well as web workers. Sometimes what you have to remember is that if lower layer it doesn't need your jQuery or DOM dependencies, it might be possible that even your upper layers don't require it. For example, if when you are using a different programming model in a UI5 web component API way. So this is how the modularization took place in UI5. The beginning, yeah, it is existing applications as well as the initial framework, which was listed here, which is listed here up to the version 1.52. There are a lot of globals here, and we have very large modules. And the applications which are accessing these modules were actually not doing it in asynchronous way. So this is a bad situation. So we had to address it. That's exactly what we did in 1.54. So we split the modules and then we separated them in two different layers. One is UI, which is having some feature set, and the second one is base layer, which is independent of DOM as well as jQuery. In 1.56, this continued again, but we in 1.54 as well, we did had some compatibility layer, even if you are using globals. So there is a way that your application should not break. In 1.56, so this continued. Again, we introduced one layer called a stubbing layer. So this stubbing layer, it makes sure that even if you are using potential usage of globals are there, so your applications are still up and running. And yet it was not yet released to the customer. So it's a big weight, right? So when you're moving from sync to async, it's a big weight. So everything is now available in 1.58. Here you can see that uh, there is some traffic light kind of combination, which just says that how much mature your application is all about. Yeah, we want all of you to be there to rightmost corner where it's a green line and it's go to line. What does that mean? You're accessing all the modules without having to access through some of the compatibility layer. And yellow line, again, it signifies that you still have managed to do this dependency management, but there are some legacy APIs included. So even those things works with the compatibility layer. And the last one, which is red one, which is not very good position to be there. So, if your application is somehow working, you have not done anything, but still we want to support that too, and that will be using stubbing layer. So we all want you to move towards the green line. and we want to support you for that. And the last one, but not the least one. So here you see there is a direct link from target framework to base layer. So what does this mean? As I mentioned before, it is like you can now develop your node applications, or if you're developing applications using web component APIs, so you can directly access this base layers. All right. The next one, yeah. Uh, every one of us, we want to make shift from sync to async. Uh, so not much explanation needed here. So, but the thing is, just to mention, so if you are using synchronous APIs, your application will be slow because everything is blocked. One request is waiting for other requests to complete. So we want to make sure that this thing will get rid of this thing, uh, get rid of all these things, etc. So one of the most elegant way that we do it right now is using promises. So you can see a lot of promises in UI5 evolution code right now. So uh, if you don't know much about promises or something, we encourage you to invest some time in that because it's really worth it. So what are the asynchronous APIs that we are talking about? Uh, the main motive again was to replicate the sync XHR and establish asynchronous APIs for loading all the libraries, components, views, controllers, and even your I18 files. And there are some asynchronous APIs that we have already introduced in 1.52, that is for XML view processing. And it's like we are making more of the shift from async even to AMD-like syntax so that you can use your required JS and other technologies to load all the modules. Okay, so there's again questions, right? For are we supporting ES6 or not? So yeah, we are almost there. I mean, we cannot do it all at once and then stop. But currently we are making shift from sync to async and then async to AMD like syntax, and then in future it's a near future that we see that we'll be supporting all the ES6 modules as well. So with this, we have also included TypeScript in the upper layers if you really want to use TypeScript and transpile your code. And for the frameworks that are mainly, why are we blocked with ES5 right now? That is mainly, as you know, it's because of the browser compatibility matrix. So we'll be making shift, and we have already done some of it. So we'll be there for ES6 modules. Yeah, yeah. In async APIs and loader, also what is this loader is all about now? So this load, we never had a loader before. There was no separate module for loading all your libraries. It was somehow buried into the core and other stuff. So in in the latest slides, you will see that there is this loader. There is a dedicated UI5 loader which will now load all your modules. We'll see the short demo of it. Okay, yeah. So in 1.52, so this red line, it's always a no, right? So we'll not do that. How many are still using jQuery, SAP declare and require? Yeah, we encourage you to get rid of it. Thank you so much for raising your hands. So yeah. In 1.52 itself, if you see, there was a definition of sap.ui.define as well as require. So we wanted to make shift from sync to async. Even though these things are there, it was not used for all modules. It was mainly used for the preloads, and then we have to improve it again. So in 1.54, you can see this is a new block. UI5 loader is now a new block, and even it was loading things in a synchronous way, but you using some tweaks and then some settings, you could have somehow achieved loading modules in asynchronous way, but it was difficult. Even more to improve, in 1.56, it's more of your best friend to load all the modules. So it is more of a require JS kind of syntax. And then in the global public API, you can even set the modules to be loaded in AMD way. That is just by using one line code, that is UI.loader.config, you can just config this one and then set AMD as true. Still, even these require JS syntax is there. I mean, uh, is now introduced. We are again providing backward compatibility with sap.ui.define and sap.ui.require. These things are again still existing, even if you just want to go back to asynchronous way of loading all the modules. Can we switch back to the laptop? Okay. So this is just a snippets, nothing much. Uh, so what do we have here? In the line 9, you can now see that there is a special, I mean, we are doing something different apart from loading the code, right? So what we are doing is we are loading UI5 loader here, and then, I'm sorry, yeah. It's better now? Okay. So there is a separate module, UI5 loader, and then we are configuring it. How are we doing it? So we are specifying in script source that we have to load UI5 loader, and then here we are loading the core. This is one of the new ways of doing it. So here we are loading the core, and in the core, after once the core libraries are loaded, you can see that we are doing some usual stuff like attaching init, and then inside init, we are requiring a button. So this button, and then we are providing all the properties and placing the content at some specific div. Now, what is the one more thing that we mentioned when we are talking about asynchronous modules was that you can now make it work like AMD-like syntax using your require.js libraries. So this, all you have to do is you just have to set it to AMD to true, and then you can even remove this sap.ui keywords, and then let's see. So now what we're doing is we are switching to AMD syntax, and then we are just using plain require undefined APIs. So even though you are making these changes and your application is yet again up and running fine, so uh, so this is a way for your production applications again. So we are supporting simple use cases right now. And if, for example, if you are expecting some of the extensions and plugins to be included, it's not yet there. So we'll be there for the production applications. As of now, we suggest you to use sap.ui.require and define. Can we switch back to the presentation? Yeah. Okay. So what have we shipped so far? In 1.54, again, just a second, yeah. We promoted SAP UI define as well as SAP UI require, and we have added split the code, basically the entire layers into different modules, right? But this was again internal release, and even though it was an internal thing, we have added a disclaimer that you can go ahead and use it. In 1.56 again, we have introduced a stubbing layer, even if you are using globals as well as there are some missing dependencies, so your application is still up and running. There's no problems to it. And in 1.58, there were again more fine granular modules, and we suggest you to just replace jQuery.sap namespace with these things, and these modules again became public, and we just removed all the calls to jQuery.sap APIs. I mean namespaces. And then in 1.58, the jQuery, as you see, has been removed from the very lowest layer, that is the base layer. So, and if anywhere, if it is required, then it has been pushed to the upper layers in the UI layer. Again, you have DOM-less base core and UI layers, a clear separation between jQuery dependencies and not having jQuery dependencies. In 1.54, again, we had basic AMD compatible UI5 loader. So, but in 1.56, it is more robust. Even you can do the configuration with the public APIs. Just we saw that demo, if you remember. With the part of asynchronous APIs, we have already replaced many sync APIs by async alternatives. And then we have even introduced in 1.52, I remember, yeah, we have introduced even XML template preprocessor. So, and in 1.54, we reduced all the sync calls and coupled renderer plus control. And the first ever open UI5 sample app was now starting with fully asynchronous, in a fully asynchronous way. In 1.56, again, we harmonized global factory APIs. So we tried to introduce everything in an asynchronous manner. We'll briefly touch on this, but there is a detailed session planned at 2:15. So whatever the changes we are talking about, if you're making these changes, and then if you want to really see the effect, you have to use proper tooling and bundling. There are two different approaches to bundling right now. The one is preload, and the second one is self-contained. What does this mean? So we have open UI5 sample application here, and then we are using SAP Core and SAP M libraries. In a preload way, so all these libraries, whatever you are using, are bundled as preloads, right? And in self-contained way, if you see, but is it good enough? It is good enough for some usages. If for example, if you are launching your application in Fiori Launchpad, so there, you're probably using more controls and stuff. So uh, it makes sense to include whole library, right? But let's see if you are shipping your application as a standalone application in a mobile device, would it still so this for this use case we have to think differently. So what we have to do is we have to include the things that we want, the modules that we want, but we have to let go the modules that we really don't require. So one of the fastest way, one of the first best way to make your application fast is to not include the dependencies which are not required, right? So you can also see the size difference, right? Based on the controls that we are using, entire library is there, and you're using only a couple of controls and stuff here, and you're really minimizing the size of the application. You can actually see the size difference. Yeah, again, just a reminder, we have a session at 2:15 planned. It's very important that you attend that session and get benefit out of it. Can we switch to laptop, please? Yeah, I'll log in, I'm sorry. Okay, so, all right. So this is not a complex application again. So I'll increase the font so that things are clearer. Uh, so, okay. This is a preload version of, uh, but this is bundled in a preload way. So I'll just refresh this application. It's up and running. Okay, cool. Now you can see that there are two preloads which are loaded in the initial. Yeah, it's here. Yeah. So when you're bundling your applications in a preload way, so all your libraries are bundled and preloads are created for each libraries. So you can see that these things are loaded initially with in an asynchronous way. Uh, Again, this is a self-contained uh, bundling. Just a second. Yeah. Cool. So what happens when you bundle it in a self-contained way? Yeah. You can see it's just loaded in 933 ms, but we have to reduce that. We'll do that. And yeah, now there are no preloads and things like that. You just have one SAP UI custom.js where things are, if you just open this, I think, yeah, you can see all things are minimized and then these things are loaded here. So there is again, we'll not go much deeper into this. Please do attend that session for the building. Can we go back to slides? Cool. Yeah, so we talked a lot about, you know, we did this, and then let's see how can we actually use the changes in our application to make it more fast and more compatible way. So I would like to call upon Frederic. So he'll be discussing you and shedding light on UI5 best practices. So thank you, Frederic.
Good. Thank you very much.
I think you need it.
Yeah, I need this. Good. Okay, so after much theory, we're going to look at some of the real code examples now. Like, what does it really mean to use these asynchronous APIs? And there's plenty of them. So we will go through a number of these today. This is roughly the topics. So we'll talk about asynchronous loading. That's one of the topics. AMD-like module definition, avoiding globals, and some more APIs. Yeah? So let's look at asynchronous loading of views. So one of the things that was always difficult for us was that we had this manifest JSON, right? In the manifest, you define the routing for the views in your application. And when we came up with an asynchronous way how to load these views, we understood that there was a bit of a problem because we couldn't automatically do this in the core. Like, because the configuration has to be done right here in manifest.json. You see, for example, the root view itself needs to be switched to asynchronous, right? But also the routing can happen in an asynchronous way. And what that lets us do is, for example, when a route is matched and you load a particular view, this view can, for example, do some pre-processing, right? And this pre-processing might rely on information which is not yet available, maybe a fetch to get some metadata from a backend system, some annotations, some OData metadata in the typical case. And this request we would like to do in an asynchronous way, but we cannot if the view processing itself is synchronous. That means at this point in time, everything happens in a synchronous way, and that is blocking the screen, and then you get this sort of weird animation, and things are not fluent anymore. So this is a very important first step. Switch this stuff onto asynchronous. In most cases, this will work just fine out of the box. Give it a try. It's a very simple thing to do. And with this, you give us the possibility to handle, let's say, the rest behind the scenes. This one is the biggest one if you write standalone applications. If you're a developer, you don't have to worry about this because this is handled by the Launchpad itself. But what this flag does, this SAP UI preload async, is maybe the most crucial thing to quickly improving the performance. If you do it already, I love you. It's amazing. That's very important. Maybe let's talk about a bit what happens when you set it to synchronous. When you set this on to synchronous, we just saw all of the preloads. Then all of the definitions that are up there under SAP UI libs, sub-m, it could be a number of other libraries. All of these things will be fetched in a synchronous sequential fashion, right? So all of the sub-m library will get loaded. Nothing else happens in the browser meanwhile. Then the next library will be loaded while nothing happens in the browser in the meanwhile. And this causes the whole application to be stuck in this loading loop for quite a while. Just switching it to preload means all of the requests go out in parallel. And at the same time, the browser can start processing additional content already, right? When all of the preloads are finished, you get a callback into your application. Many of you know this attach init function of the core, right, in the index HTML. This will be called when all of this asynchronous loading is done. So many times I see that you have an attach init with some content, but it's loading it synchronously. It's not really doing the thing, right? Just switch this around. Use the attach init, and all of the directly out of the box, you will see a big performance improvement right away. So very simple again to do this. Make sure you have this in place. And now we'll get into a number of APIs really that have changed. And this might look a bit complicated, but they always follow the same pattern. On the left-hand side, you see, let's say, the classic API. SAP UI component, for example, would instantiate a component with the name my.comp, right? What this does is, this is a function call, right? SAP UI component actually calls a function. This function needs to be completed before the rest of the code can be executed, right? So that's a synchronous function. And everything that happens within needs to now happen in a synchronous way, right? Because the program does not wait for this to be finished, right? So if any resources need to be loaded, if any views need to be loaded from the server, all of this will automatically be a synchronous request, right? And that's because the API is synchronous. Now on the right-hand side, you see an asynchronous version of this, where there's a callback in a promise, right, the .then, that decouples the processing from the execution of the rest of this program, right? So the initial function will be called and will return, and you can progress, the program can basically continue underneath. And once all of the loading is done, then the callback will be called. So that's an important differentiation to do, right? And these promises for many of these APIs are now in place. So it's not very hard to switch the code around. You basically go in, you use the promise, the .then, you put a callback in place as you should do in JavaScript, and then all of the processing logic goes in there, and then you're basically done, right? This is how to make use of these asynchronous APIs. Now for this SAP UI component, this interface, it grew over time. Like we made, first we understood, okay, when we create such a component, we need to load a manifest. The manifest file basically contains the information, as I said, of the routing, but it also contains information of the used data models and the data sources, right? So when a component gets loaded, right now we would create the component, then the programming inside would kick in, and sometime later we would instantiate an OData model, and only then we would actually send a request to fetch the metadata for this OData model. This already all happened at a quite late stage in time. With this manifest true, what we did is we said, okay, let's do this in parallel. Let's actually fetch the manifest file first for a component, then create an instance, and at the same time already create instances of the models, for example, right? So we create an instance of an OData model at a very early stage in time, allowing it to fetch the metadata, while the rest of the component is still being progressed. When this is then available, we inject the model back into the component. And with this, we can make everything run in parallel and much, much faster than before, right? So this was the manifest true, and then we wanted to do the whole thing async, so we had another API, and this was sort of how we built this over time, right? You can see the history of our decisions sort of in this API, and this isn't great, so there's a new way how to do this today. Since 1.56, you can create a component by using a new API. It's just component.create, right? And you see there's a bit of new syntax above it, right? You have the SAP UI require. This is telling us that you need a particular module, right? We modularized everything. So this is one module, the SAP core component module that you need. And you specify it in the brackets, right? Saying this is the module name that needs to be loaded. And when this is done, the function, the callback function is called, right? It's this function component gets passed in, so we get an instance of this reference sort of to the module. We get this passed into the callback function, and then we can do the component.create on it. The component.create only needs the name of the component, so async and manifest first and stuff. So this is already handled below this API, right? You don't have to specify it anymore. But this again says, please load the component, and again there will be an asynchronous callback. So it's getting used to this sort of pattern. It's not just a function call, but it's always a function call and then a callback, right? That needs to happen. It's the same pattern over and over again, right? So, but here you see for the first time this new sort of syntax, SAP UI require, specifying one or more modules that you require from the loader, right? And then once all of these asynchronous requests have finished, you get a reference to them back, right? And then you can process the next steps. Let's look at another example. So this was a component container example, right? We had an API to create a new instance of a component container. This is what you need to render a component on the page. So the API was, again, synchronous, right? It said new SAP UI core component container, and then you directly got a reference back the o.cont, right? This one. And you could then place it on the page, and it would start to render right away. Right? So there was no way for the program to wait until all of the processing was done. You directly rendered it at this particular point in time. Now on the right-hand side, once again, similar function, right? You now specify, using SAP UI require, that you need this component container module. And once it's loaded, the callback is executed. Then once again, you say, okay, you need a component container instance. And then the asynchronous loading is specified, async true, right? And there's now a callback function again, component created. So this one will be called when it's done. So it's again a callback happening at this level, right? So it's every time the same sort of pattern. Use the modules or declare the modules that you need, wait for them to be loaded, call functions on these modules, wait for them to be loaded. That's the sort of asynchronous programming you need to get used to, right? Another one, really bad and ugly, right? This is an interface we had for quite a while. SAP UI get core load library. Right? When you write this line, sap.m will be fetched. Everything is stopped in the browser because all of this code is loaded and executed now. We see a lot of apps still using this sort of API to load a dependent library that they need, that they did not specify at the beginning of the program in the manifest or in some other dependencies, right? On the right-hand side, you see a simple alternative to this. It's not very hard, right? You just extend the call of this function with this async true flag as a configuration option of the function, yeah? And then you get the callback. Again, you have a promise, right? And so you can do all of the processing you had underneath the left side, right? And just plug it into this function, right? And already you're done using the asynchronous APIs. It's not too hard. It's always the same way to use this. Same is true for texts, right? It's also a file that has to be loaded from the server. Left-hand side, again, and the synchronous API. On the right-hand side, we were able to directly give you a promise back as soon as we have loaded a file, a translation file, and then you can work with the texts that are contained within. A lot of the times on the left-hand side, you saw something like jQuery SAP resources, and then with the resource bundle, that you would say something like resource bundle.getText, right, to put a text somewhere on the screen maybe. And that would always force a synchronous request. And then we have another thing in place that if the file is not available in, let's say, Hebrew, then we fall back to English, and then we fall back to a base language. So it would actually create 3 different requests to the server synchronously, right? While on the right-hand side, now this is all decoupled, right? And the program is still responding. Another example, loading views. So sometimes you have to load a view to plug it in to a container or something, right? Very common use case. So on the left-hand side, this is the JavaScript way to get access to a view programmatically. SAP UI view, you pass the name of the view and the type, usually XML. And with this reference, you can now take it and add it to an aggregation, for example, right? And make it show up on the screen somewhere. It's again an asynchronous API, so all of the loading of the view, its related resources and maybe subviews or any content inside has to go via synchronous APIs calls, right? So on the right-hand side, very simple to change this. You just add a flag, async true, and you get the callback, right? Similar pattern, so not too hard, but with this, no problem. We can take the rest and make sure that it stays fluent. Since 1.56, we also improved this. Remember, you again see sort of how we built up on this, adding flags and flags. So sometimes for the components, the containers, and for the views, we think new modern directly asynchronous API makes more sense. So the new one looks like this. Once again, similar setup. You require the view as a module. Once you have access to it, just call the view.create method. We obviously still need the name and the type. And then you get the callback as before. Good. So AMD like module definition is the second topic. jQuery SAP declare, jQuery SAP require. We said we want to get rid of jQuery in the core layers, right? In all of the module loading aspects. So there are these alternatives, SAP UI define and require. And we'll look at the details of those. The define is when you create a module and you basically define what the module should have as dependencies, right? These dependencies will be loaded immediately before the module code gets executed. Right, that's the normal way to say, okay, I know for sure that my code will require access to a button, to a view, to a component, or something like this. Just specify it in the SAP UI define syntax. And the moment all of these dependencies are available, the callback is loaded, right? It's executed. SAP UI require is for a dynamic loading of modules where you have maybe an if-else situation, right? Maybe the user pressed a button, now you need to load something. That's orchestrating the code a bit better, right? That means as soon as some activity happens, you need access to a module, require it. But don't require it synchronously like in the past. Use the require statement, wait for the callback to come in, and then you can execute the code on top of it, right? And that's decoupling it once again. Not sure if this is still running. Can you? Yeah, okay. Just a second. Trying to get the slides working again. Perfect, thanks. So this is a very simple example of how to migrate from the classic way of declaring these dependencies to the new way, right? On the left, you see jQuery SAP declare. That would be the name of the component that you've just written, right? And jQuery SAP require would indicate you need that module. This line would directly fetch the file, right? Synchronously. Down below, you can now work with the button and do some stuff, right? And this is how you normally wrote code. On the right-hand side, it's fairly simple to translate that. The module myButton is now defined using the SAP UI define syntax. You first pass the name of the module that you are just writing. And then in an array, you just specify all of its dependencies, right? In this case, it was just one. It was the sub M button. So just move it over and put it in the slash syntax, right? That's the name of the module now. And then as soon as that dependency is fulfilled, the loader has fetched it, you get the callback, right? And then with this button, you can do whatever you wanted to do. Like before, it's the same sort of code. But down below, you have a line right here that says on click, right? There's an SAP M message box, right? This message box was never required up above. So this again causes the system to fetch the file, if it's not yet there, right? Fetch the file and cause a synchronous request. On the right-hand side, you see how to avoid this, right? We did not declare a dependency to message box up in the define array because we don't know if the user will click on the button, right? But if he does, we do the dynamic loading, right? We put in sub UI require. We tell the system that we need the message box instance. And once it's there, then we work on it, right? So this is sort of thinking, what do you need immediately for sure, and what do you need later on? Define, require, right? Those are the two APIs. Good. Should I try this again, or? Okay, so good. Get rid of those. Not sure if this is still working, so maybe I'll have to tell you to slip to the next slide. Please click twice to the right. If you can, just go to the next one. Yeah. Good. But I think, while we're working on these slides, I think you get the point, right? It's always the same sort of pattern. It's not too hard. Once you start using it, it will feel totally natural to always do it like this. This slide is a bit more technical. It meant that we had some situations in the code where you had to check whether an instance passed back is of a certain type, right? It's something that could happen on the left-hand side. You have an instance off comparison, right? And the moment the SAP XY button was checked for its type, if the module wasn't there yet, we would do a synchronous request again. So there were ways to get around this, yeah, checking it a bit differently, but now there's a new way to do this. So if you have to do such a type comparison in the future, and that's already a very specific thing, but if you want to do this, there's this function now on the SAP UI base object, right? There's a comparison function we built that does not rely on fetching the full definition of the module, right? So since you need the SAP UI base object, it's again the same thing. You require, you define the dependency to SAP UI base object in the array. Once you have it, you can now call a comparison function called isA, and then you can compare the type versus the instance of something, right? It's quite advanced. Let's look at control renderers and controls. For those of you who've written controls, you know that there's a control.js file that defines the behavior, and there's a control renderer file that contains the renderer code, right? And they are not connected in any way, right? There's only a naming convention, how to put these files in the system. And for us, that's a problem, because for the build tooling, creating these self-contained bundles, if you need a control, you will also need the renderer, right? But it's nowhere specified as in a system as a dependency, right? So we said a best practice from now on, if you write a control, and this is a typical control module, put in the dependency to the renderer as one of the dependencies this module has, right? So just the dot/text renderer is just a dependency declaration on this level. So our tooling can pick this up and then bundle it together. Simple thing. Avoiding globals. SAP.m.text means you access a module on a global namespace, right? We did register all of our namespaces to the window object, basically, which at the time felt like a good idea. It's not so much. So obviously, this should not happen anymore. If you need an SAP.m text, we just learned that you use the require, SAP UI require functionality to get access to this module and then use it instead, right? So maybe let's stick with this for a second. The SAP dot namespace and the jQuery SAP namespaces are typically indications that you're working with global namespaces, right? Those should be a trigger that they should be reworked somehow, right? With the first one, the SAP, as I said, use the require instead, get the module instance back, something like text, and then you do the new text, whatever you want to do with it. And jQuery SAP should be rewritten altogether. For this, we also have provided alternative modules which do not require this namespace anymore. Good. And picking up on this slide, obviously, you now see there's a bit of thinking of what should I do in my application that's required. Using it means doing some of these code changes, right? And it's a good practice, because if you do, you'll feel like writing synchronous APIs feels like the wrong thing to do, especially in JavaScript that should not be done. So try this out and practice this a bit. And I'm sure that you'll get the hang of it and then make it your normal routine when writing code. Good. Then thanks very much. We're at the end. If you have questions, I'll be around to answer them. Thank you. Good.
Yeah, if you have any questions, we can take it up. Yeah. Anyone who has a question?
We could do it right away. Yeah.
What if we want to load third-party libraries? I mean,
Say it again?
Third-party libraries, just like Moment.js or some JS libraries.
Right. I think for this, let me quickly think what's the best way to do this. If you package the libraries or put them in your local file system, right? So there's basically, let's say there are two ways. If sometimes you have libraries that are loaded just using an in-place script tag where you have access to the outside reference, right? Maybe loading stuff from a CDN or so. In this case, you can just put the script tag in place. And then obviously, all of that code will be executed as is. That means if they register globals, you access it according to their system. Otherwise, we've already seen that if you use third-party modules, you integrate them as a script tag, and they use the AMD syntax, then you can use the same module loading principles as we saw. So you switch the loader to AMD support, and then you can also get access to those modules in a way. If you package that locally, you can register the namespace to this JS file, right? And then use the loader to fetch the file with the naming like my third-party library dot something .js, and then it will basically load it from the local file system or from the server, just like any other module that we have, right? So it's the same functionality, but registering it is something you can do in the Bootstrap to have a particular namespace point to a folder within your project. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hey, the change wherein we are moving from jQuery required to SAP UI resources, this will be downward compatible, right? Because a lot of resources are already deployed, a lot of applications have already been developed and running in production, right? At a lower version which uses jQuery.sap.require, right?
Exactly. So
will
this was the stubbing layer we saw before. In this picture of migrating step by step, there's a stubbing layer that basically provides compatible access to this sort of API. We encourage to switch to the defined syntax, to use the modules directly. That's on the right-hand side, the green arrow, right?
Yeah.
Going straight to the modules. But obviously, until then, we understand that this code is in place and we keep it compatible. Yes.
Yeah, because a lot of apps are already running on that
Yeah,
code.
yeah,
So
of course. Yeah. A lot of our apps are still also running on this. So
yeah, it's not easy to convince customer just to change all
definitely
the apps,
not.
right?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Good.